My name is Haven Tyler, and I'm a client relations executive at Boston Engineering, and I focus on medical devices. So I'm really excited to be with everybody today, including my colleagues Mike Marcoux and Chris Morgan. So we're going to have a chat about medical device development and kind of some of the things that we've been running across as we navigate our professional lives. So with that, I thought I might jump to Mike first, and I just wanted to ask if you could share some of your observations that you've had sort of recently on the device side of things, like the biggest kind of watch outs. Like what are some of the pitfalls that you're finding that our clients run into when they're developing their complex systems?
It's a great question. Um, in Boston Engineering, we span the gamut of large to medium to entry level device people who are trying to get like a product to market, and sometimes it's you kind of want to do everything with your device, but you don't have time to do everything. So can you identify sort of and Chris turned me on to this phrase as like the minimally viable product, like what can you get to market as a good entry point and be successful, right? But that doesn't preclude you from identifying all the things you want to do, right? You can start that in sort of your requirements, and then hey, these are my must-haves. These are kind of the nice-to-haves. Can you build a roadmap early for what you might push to like a Rev 2 or beyond? And what sort of hooks or things can you build into what you're doing now to make that a little bit easier? A lot of times they'll call that future proofing or things of that nature. But if you can think of it in terms of like a product family or something like that you might have down the road, it can pay dividends if you do a little bit of work up front or decide smartly, hey, this might be a little bit too costly to build in some of these things now. Or might take a little bit too long, but there might be some things that are easier to do at this point or leave the space for that you can address later on.
So it sounds to me, this notion of the minimally viable product is really cool one. I thank you for bringing that up. But it sounds to me like in order to get there, that there's a lot of sort of pre-thinking and pre-planning that needs
Hmm.
to go on. Um, and we at Boston Engineering, we have clients come to us at all different sort of points of where they are in their sort of evolution. Um, what would your advice be to somebody who's just sort of starting out to think about developing a complex medical system, and um, like what kinds of things do they need to be thinking about in their pre-planning?
That's a great question. And we've seen this on a couple different programs and projects where some of the larger device manufacturers have it pretty well figured out and of who the stakeholders are, and they have access to those people, or they will set up early stage developments to like, hey, this is what we're thinking, get the feedback and incorporate that, change requirements. If you're just starting off and doing this for the first time, uh, don't underestimate identifying those stakeholders, the users, the doctors, clinicians, whoever it might be using your device, and getting that feedback early. You might have an idea of what you think this device needs to be, but without that feedback, you could find yourself pretty far down a development path and then have to backtrack based off of user feedback. We've seen that a couple times, and that can be really costly and detrimental to like a startup per se, right? Like you might have some VC backing, you might have some money, but then to find out like, hey, I have to make this course correction. I thought it was going to be X, and what they really want is Y. Or they're like, yeah, this is a complete no go to do it this way, from a user perspective. And sometimes it comes from the doctor, sometimes it might come from someone who you didn't expect, or other things like, hey, we're in this suite and we don't have a lot of room. I don't want this as a floor standing unit. Get it off, get it on an IV pole, things of that nature, things that you might not have thought of. So sometimes getting that early interaction and sort of direction is good. And sometimes you could do it with a conceptual like drawing of like this is what I'm thinking, or whatnot. You don't even have to have those real models, but to have those meaningful discussions sometimes can point you in a different direction than what you anticipated.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, that sort of pre-planning and that sort of engaging of the stakeholders needs to happen at a really early stage, and it can also be it doesn't necessarily need to be that formalized.
Yeah.
So being able to do sketches and things like that, because to me as a if I were novice to this, it would sound daunting, like, "Oh, I have to do all this, stakeholder interviews," and it would feel like it was a really, complex process, but it sounds like maybe it could be sort of simplified and get some really important insights up front.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's it's valuable. You might not always think about it, or maybe you have like a preconceived notion, and we all don't know what we don't know, but we might have an idea of what we think it should be. And sometimes getting those different perspectives can be very illuminating, right? You'll realize something that you never even thought of or understood of how something is kind of being done presently and how you're thinking you can improve it. Maybe you identify other things, or you get volunteered information that you weren't even looking for. Like, hey, this is also like a bone of contention, or like this is like a sore spot with these types of devices. Or if you could really improve this, it helps me so greatly. You'll get people just to volunteer. Like, people are very forthcoming with complaints, right? If you just look online for
I have
anything,
found that to be true in my own life, yes.
like how many, like if people don't go on the internet to volunteer like a good review, they're usually going there to complain about something. And I think that's just human,
Absolutely.
human nature, is everybody has an idea of like a better way to do things, or what it noise. Hey, I do this day in and day out. If you could do this, man, that would be so great. So sometimes you'll get sort of that anecdotal stuff.
It may also affirm kind of assumptions you've made, right? It's
Hmm.
not necessarily just kind of thinking about the nervousness of kind of going out there and putting your ideas out in front of people. It may turn out that most things line up, and then there's a few questions that kind of drive perhaps prototyping or testing, right?
Yeah.
Where you kind of build a model, 3D print something, put together a process, and kind of go for another round of, hey, what do you think about these changes to it, or hey, specifically this area, what are your thoughts? Yeah.
No, that's a great point as well. Um, yeah, sometimes you'll get validation of like, wow, we're on track with these things, so that's good. Let's keep on going in that direction.
Yeah, people are generally very willing to be helpful, right? Willing to give you advice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. Before we sort of continue on with some of the questions I have here, I just want to encourage the folks who are listening and watching
Mhm.
this live. Please add questions or comments. We're happy to address those as they come in. So I just wanted to let you know that we hope that this can be interactive as well. Um, but I wanted to move on, Chris, because I know that as a world, we're all thinking about data security, right? I mean, from a personal perspective, but also, in our world, in the medical device world, it's like really, I mean, it's crucially important. So, how are you sort of advising your clients in terms of like potential tampering or vulnerabilities, that kind of thing? I'd love to sort of kickstart a little bit of a conversation around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, to kind of talking about this is the cybersecurity aspects of a product or a system. Uh, that data flow is a valuable business asset, right? So you're going to have connectivity for a particular value add to the customer, to the operator, to the maintenance side of things. Understanding what the value of that data is kind of your first step, right? What do I want to transfer? Why is it valuable? What do I need to have in that data that's going between these various devices? Putting together a plan, understanding where your risk areas are. To your point, in Mike, from the mechanical side, you might be concerned about device tampering. So in
Mm.
that case, you're going to looking at things like security screws, anti-tamper labels, other ways to prevent physical device alteration as well. Because people think cybersecurity, they're always thinking about access to some ephemeral thing on the internet, right? Some communications protocol. But physical tampering is another aspect of security as well.
Yeah. No, that's true. And it's all the news stories are usually about card skimming and things getting hacked and whatnot. There is a mechanical element to some things, right? If you can get a device open, you're probably in trouble, right? Now, hopefully, with med device, there's lots less of that happening, but you never know.
Yeah, and I think just kind of starting at what's the value add to having the connectivity, and then working your way through that risk profile. Ultimately, the goal of cybersecurity is to be in control of those risks, right? You don't want the device to be in the field and someone to discover a risk, and now you're out of control. You're being reactive to an issue with your system or processes. But by kind of front loading that, understanding the systems, building that risk profile, you kind of take back that control from a potential attacker. You can choose where you're going to focus your efforts, and you're going to focus them in areas that are going to be the most valuable for preserving the integrity of your system.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about this notion of sort of bringing it back to kind of the planning and pre-planning, and the sort of minimally viable product. So if, let's just say hypothetically, you've got a list of requirements and specifications for the best system in the world, and it's going to do everything you need it to do, and it's going to fly through all the regulatory, and it's just going to be fantastic. But the reality is you may not be able to achieve all of those goals in the first round. So how do you reconcile that with the MVP? Like, how do you weight those priorities?
Yeah, a lot of that's going to come from what you're trying to demonstrate, what the overall value is. There is going to have to be a trade-off. It's pretty common to go through and look at all the different features as a pool, but what you really want to do is organize them by priority. Which ones are the most valuable? We're trying to prove out X. This is a real disruptor if we do Y. Those are the things that you kind of put first, and then clearly if you don't have enough time, maybe it doesn't make sense to wait until you have every feature in any case, right? Getting something out to the market that is that's going to be disruptive, it's going to be advantageous to the end user. That's a huge value rather than trying to get it perfect. So for sure, having a carefully prioritizing, I think is something that we've seen be pretty effective in controlling the scope of an effort.
Sort of like that old adage that better is the enemy of good, right? Are you good enough versus keep on iterating before you can get it to market. Sometimes you have to just make that push.
I work on the software side, so from that perspective, if you've got the ability to update software in your device, whether it be interactively or through physically touching, or whether it be over the air, that can be a huge advantage. Right, having the over the air update in place allows you then to start adding on these features and as you're rolling out, advancing your systems.
So, what would your advice be, both Mike and Chris, in terms of advising folks who want to sort of stay in front of all these potential pitfalls or gotchas, and be sort of prepared and not reacting all the time, sort of in the future? What would your advice be for folks on that?
You want to start this one, Mike? Or
no, I was going to take
Sorry, I don't know if that was a terrible question.
No, that's a good question. It's we tend to, or at least you hear about a lot of things being reactionary, right? So I think it is really hard to have that sort of proactive discussion about how we can mitigate certain things, right? And I don't know, how do you identify sort of what's the vehicle for that? Does it come out of like a DFMEA? Does it come out of your risk register, and sort of how you plan to develop a strategy to address these things as they kind of happen or as they could happen. I think the hard part is sometimes when it comes to things like security, it's always something you didn't anticipate, right? As the technology evolves, so doesn't like the hacking or sort of the bypasses. There's been genius level things that people come up with of ways to mitigate and get around things that were very smart to do from a security perspective. And we're even seeing it with things that were tried and true for years. Is like you hear stories of people breaking into mailboxes and stuff like that, and it's like, wow, this thing's been around forever. Why is this now an issue? And this mailbox in my street now just has a very tiny slot in it instead of like the drawer that opens. And it's like, well, that's the mitigation. But who saw that coming, right? So I think that's the hard part is, as much as you have to put on your creative thinking hat for designing these devices, can you do the same for how you can foresee that abuse, or can you think of it as creatively of how I would try to hack these things, right?
Yeah, and cybersecurity is a process, so it doesn't stop when the product has been finished designed, right? If you're thinking about cybersecurity, you've got to connect with the product. If it's connected, it's connected to something. From that perspective, just being on top of it, right? Having a security officer is a very common thing in companies, and their job is to look at all these processes, right? To try to monitor what the threat environment looks like, look at what your system might use for technologies and how they map up to advisories, right? So there's various security lists where you get an advisory for a given product or technology, and then you want to basically be keyword mapping, kind of keeping abreast of that relative to, hey, are we using this particular payment authentication system that just had some sort of a password breach, right? That's a kind of stuff that kind of continuing process to try to address. For sure, on the device design side, making sure you've got proper layering, you're kind of baking in enough stuff that you feel that to Mike's point, everything is hackable. You want to make whoever's hacking it work very, very, very hard to get there and have as little as they can get, right? Give up as little ground as possible.
Yeah. No, that's a good point, because I'm sure Chris can remember the days of like the big data boom of like, I don't know what we're going to do with it, but collect everything, right? And now it's a lot
that could
more.
never have any downsides. If
Yeah.
collected that.
But now it has to be more I don't know, tactical or strategic, of like, I'm only interested in collecting this, and then making sure that it's secure, right?
Because that might reduce your that's going to reduce your exposure. So we worked on a few devices where there's no HIPAA data coming back from the device. The device talks to something on the other end, and that other side, mobile device or cloud service, that knows about patient information, but the device itself doesn't have any of that. So from that perspective, you don't have to worry about HIPAA in data security. For patient information, because you're not transferring anything. So kind of being smart about what you collect and what you transfer allows you to control some of that as well.
So, Chris, do you anticipate seeing more of that type of connectivity where it seems like there's slightly lower risk?
No, I would think that just in terms of threat threat vectors, you can go after the devices themselves, and I think that that's one potentially appealing place to go. But if they're connected to the internet, now you have something that's accessible everywhere. So going after the device, it might be a one-on-one activity if you're trying to physically interact with it. But all these internet connected services, they are a large attack surface. Yeah. Yeah. No one can ignore cybersecurity, and probably hasn't been for like 10 years. Although I think people sometimes you don't want to get overly worried about it, right? It's not all doom and gloom, and I think it's easy to go down that too, right? Oh, nothing is ever going to be secure and everything's hackable. So I think there's a balance, right?
Yeah.
To that whole way of thinking.
So it sounds to me, from what I'm hearing from you guys, that the pre-planning, the planning is really important, and to consider hardware, software, security, all of these things are really important to discuss. How do you think?
Being proactive. Yeah, being proactive.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Who
How do you think people or people who are developing devices, how do you like how would you guide them in terms of like really truly setting themselves up from success? I mean, we've touched on a couple of topics. Are there any other things you guys would like to cover in that regard?
Well, there is actually quite a bit of guidance from the FDA, quite a bit of guidance from other organizations, MITRE and NIST, that kind of help talk about the big picture. And I think that's where you want to start. Right? You want to look at what's the business value to the data, and then what's the what data do I have transferring around, and then you work on a systems approach. I think understanding that is going to help you get a feel for, you know, is this important information? Is this less important information? What things am I really concerned about? Well, I'm absolutely concerned about information from the internet affecting a device, causing a treatment cycle to be changed, right? That's a huge problem. Information from the device to the cloud about temperature, maybe that's not as critical a piece of data. So
Right.
it really depends. You have to understand the usage of the system, what the value is in relation to to how it can be attacked.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Chris. Sort of what data are you collecting, and how isolated it is from everything else, and is it pushed somewhere, right? So it's really more of a stream up than a stream down. Um, if you're doing post-market surveillance, right? What is the engineering team interested in knowing about the device? That's
That could help with
yeah,
help
that's
design.
different than anything related to the patient. Like, hey, how many cycles has this been? What's the average run time? Things of that nature that might give you insight into how the device is being used, or sort of what's the life on it. Things like that. Which, great, you can hack this data, but what is it going to tell you? Right? It's going to tell you like, hey, this device ran for so many hours this week, and this many times for this amount of like stuff that like why do I want that data? Make it as uninteresting as possible for the person that's hacking it. But like those are things that like everyone kind of has to contend with those devices. So how do you set yourself up for success, I guess, is have that discussion or think about it in terms of what's the risk of doing certain things and having certain features and doing it a certain way. And to Chris's point, I think he said it very well. Is like, just because things can be hacked, don't take that mentality of like, well, everything's hackable. So, what are you going to do? There's nothing we really can do about it. Someone's always going to figure it out. No, I think you still have to do, due diligence, and you still have to think it through a bit and take the appropriate like action.
Yeah, and I would say that with with the technologies we have today, with the various certificate cryptography chips, it can be very, very difficult to hack modern, well-designed devices. I think it's a kind of a testament to where the industry has been moving every year. There increased approaches and processes and technologies that make it kind of standard, right? A lot of these security approaches and processes are best practices and used everywhere, right? 20 years ago, they were kind of, people were just starting to think about what the implications were as we get these devices to be connected.
Yeah. And realize you're not alone. A lot of people have had to contend with this as well. Can you join some professional organizations and learn from others, go to MDG events or whatnot, and do some networking and find out other people's pain points. You might even identify some things that you're not thinking of that you have to address, right? Talk about sometimes scary. Hey, did I leave the house with the oven on type moments, right? Of like, oh, we're not. What is our strategy for addressing this? We don't have that. Like, maybe I need to address this too. So.
Well, this is great conversation, and I just appreciate you guys and your opinions and your perspectives. So thank you. I kind of wanted to ask a question because at Boston Engineering, excuse me, we are very fortunate in that we get to work with a really broad range of, companies, technologies, skill sets, use cases. And so that personally, I find that to be incredibly rewarding. But I think that it's each case is so unique when they come into Boston Engineering, which is, again, one of the things I really appreciate. If you were working with a startup versus sort of a really well-established sort of med device company, would these conversations be the same? Would this guidance be the same, do you think? Or would you sort of, I mean, so I'm just thinking, hypothetically, if you're a big company, you might have, big regulatory folks behind you, or you might have a big DevOps operation, or, how do you work with those two sort of very different kinds of organizations who might have a variety of different needs?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've actually, so we've run into, we work with both, right? Some companies that have an entire backend team that's built up, that all these existing products, processes. In that case, when you're looking at device changes or new devices, you're interfacing to an existing system. For smaller companies that are getting started, there are a number of existing services, cloud-based services that can provide a lot of this infrastructure for you. Now, it could be, an annual fee, it could be a per device fee. And what you're trading that fee for is that they do the maintenance on the services, they provide you kind of an API and an interface that you can use. And it's something you can get started with. You don't have to stick with it. So if you start out and you've got 1,000 devices in the field, and you're paying X number of dollars per month, well, what if you get you 1 million? It's not maybe as cost effective. But at that point, to your point, Hayden, you're going to be developing your own kind of DevOps team internally. So I think there's definitely market solutions that will help address that can address those needs depending on what size you are. Whether you're looking to go, whether you're a startup looking to get stuff in the field for prototyping or testing, to initial deployment, FDA approved, to large companies. And you want to be conscious of addressing finding a solution that fits the size of the company and the number of devices. Yeah.
No, I don't know if I could add to that, Chris. That was done very well. Well, from the mechanical, side of things, the phase gate process doesn't really change. I think to Chris's point, large organizations have their established QMS. They have their, sort of standards in place. They have a lot of things that regulatory people. Smaller companies or startups, sometimes we have to find or work with them to help them identify maybe some contract help for, like, helping them through some of the FDA stuff, or having those early discussions of, like, hey, who's going to manufacture this, and do we reach out to a CM and get that set up early, or identify, like, those paths or those tasks, and who's going to own what parts of the design or the development process. And to our earlier discussion about getting the feedback, what's the plan for getting to the users and getting user input to incorporate into sort of what the design's going to be.
Great. Thank you for that. We have a question coming in from our audience. And the question is, given all that has been said about advances in data security, data breaches continue to rise dramatically. Does the panel have any opinions on whether this means that hackers are just more talented or more diligent, or do we just have further to go in designing connected systems that are better protected?
Yeah, I think you're probably seeing two facets of it. I think the first facet is in a number of breaches. There were a number of breaches a handful of years ago that were related to schools, and it turned out that all of them use the same backend data processing. Right, all of these school systems are using the same company. Breaching that one company exposed all of those schools. So I think you've got a couple. You got a number of things going on. The first thing is that the amount of data being stored is growing at a ridiculous rate. I mean, I don't know if it's multiplying, what the factor is every year, but one can imagine that, from 2023 to 2024 is going to be X number of times more data, like stored, retrieved, uploaded from devices, etc. So the vast amount of data is growing tremendously. So any exploit that gets into any of these systems is going to have access to that corresponding increased amount of data. I would say it is kind of like an arms race. So the hackers are trying to find ways in. Security persons at companies are trying to find ways to shut people out. you are seeing very many inventive ways to get in. Like the Home Depot hack was, I believe, an in-store hack. So somebody actually got into a point of sale machine inside of a store at Home Depot. They must the network engineers clearly did not anticipate that being an attack vector. That somebody would go into a store, plug in, use that as a way to get in hindsight, it's kind of an obvious one. If you've got a network cable, you can roll up and plug into the network. So yeah, I think you're seeing basically just the outcome of a continual arms race. Best practices are being improved and tweaked. Technology is being improved. Things do get missed, and when things get missed and don't get caught in audits, you end up with situations where can somebody walk into your office and plug in your network and have access to your file servers?
Yep.
One would hope not, right? You can configure the network to not allow that communication. Yeah, I think both is true, right? Both hackers are getting sophisticated, and they're watching all the same news everybody else is. So as they see exploits, improvements, other security breaches, they learn from it just like security personnel.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that was I'll piggyback on that comment as well. So you thought of your device and being in the hospital or whatever, and being on a secure network, and you think everything's going to be fine. There was just another exploit where they were able to get all this patient data going through clinics. So my primary care has a small clinic down the street, even though she's part of a larger hospital.
Yeah, I got the same letter. Yep.
Yeah, and those clinics don't have the same protocols or the same security as like a larger organization or hospital will be. So they are sort of like, to borrow a term, like a soft target, right? You could get in there and maybe you don't even have to go in there. You just have to get close enough to bypass and get into their systems, because they don't have the same level of protocols or security that a larger organization may have. And that's the other thing to think about. So when you think about your device, where is it going to be used? Oh, hospitals. Well, is it going to be used in the clinic? What do those environments kind of look like as well in terms of the infrastructure, right? So something just to keep in mind.
Yeah, I'd say if you do apply best practices and you don't miss anything, then your device can be highly resistant to hacking. Certainly, you can do things that make it that take all the easy targets off the board, right? That's what you want to do, right? And that's a lot of these, MITRE and other organizations have threat analysis procedures where you kind of work through a workflow to look at what where your risk could be in terms of operationally to your end user. And then you use that to kind of work down that structure and develop a plan to approach it. So it's not all doom and gloom. It can definitely make these hackers work really, really, really hard to get any ground.
Yeah.
So I think we are out of time, but Mike and Chris, thank you so much. And to everyone who took the time out to listen to us and participate today,
Yeah, thank
really
you for the question.
appreciate it, and stay in touch. So I just want to say thank you and happy Friday, and have a great holiday, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.